The advertisement was unassuming enough. Overnight archivist, historical society. Part-time, flexible hours. Perfect for me, a night owl perpetually seeking quiet work away from the relentless churn of the day. I was a student then, majoring in history, and the idea of spending my nights surrounded by forgotten relics held a certain romantic appeal. Little did I know, the quiet was merely a prelude to a symphony of dread. The Historical Society occupied an old, stone building, once a public library, now a labyrinth of dusty shelves and climate-controlled vaults. My domain was the sub-basement, a cavernous space where the newest acquisitions were processed. My specific task was to catalog the contents of a recent donation, the entire surviving archive of the Blackwood Asylum, a notorious 19th century institution that had been demolished just a few months prior. Its reputation preceded it: whispers of inhumane treatments, forgotten patients, and a lingering, suffocating sadness. The first few weeks were uneventful, almost disappointingly so. My nights were a monotonous routine of unboxing, labeling, and data entry. Most of the asylum's artifacts were mundane: patient ledgers, staff rotas, faded photographs of stern-faced doctors, and rusted medical instruments that made my skin crawl. The air in the sub-basement was perpetually cold, damp, and smelled of old paper and something else, something metallic and faintly acrid, like old blood. I tried to dismiss it as the smell of decay from the old building itself. Then came Box 73. It was heavier than it looked, marked simply Patient Records, MISC. Inside, nestled amongst brittle patient files, were several small cylindrical objects made of dark, brittle wax cylinders, early audio recordings. My heart gave a little jolt. This was a true historical find. I carefully transported them to a small, isolated room in the archive where a vintage phonograph had been set up for just such discoveries. It was a beautiful, intricate machine, all brass and polished wood. I gently placed the first cylinder on the spindle, lowered the needle, and a hiss of static filled the silent room. Then, a man's voice, clipped and formal, began to speak. Patient 47, male, age 32, admitted March 1888. Diagnosis: melancholia with delusional tendencies. Session 1. The voice belonged to a doctor, Alistair Finch, one of Blackwood's chief physicians. He spoke in a calm, almost detached manner, asking a series of questions. The patient's responses were faint, barely audible whispers punctuated by long silences. It was unsettling, listening to a conversation from over a century ago, a window into a mind long since turned to dust. I listened to several more cylinders. Some were just static, others contained fragmented, incoherent ramblings from patients or terse notes from doctors. Each one felt like a phantom limb of a forgotten life. Then I reached a cylinder labeled Patient 88, female, age unknown, admitted October 1891, diagnosis, acute hysteria, Session 3. The voice of Dr. Finch was there again, but this time it was laced with a hint of exasperation. Patient 88, are you listening to me? You must cooperate. A long silence followed, broken only by the crackle of the wax. I leaned closer to the horn of the phonograph, straining to hear. Then a soft, almost imperceptible sound emerged from the background of the recording. Tap, tap, tap asterisk. It was rhythmic, faint, barely distinguishable from the static, like a slow, deliberate knock. I frowned, pausing the phonograph. Was it a defect in the cylinder? Or perhaps a noise from Dr. Finch's office? A clock? A leaky pipe? I rewound the cylinder a few seconds and played it again. Dr. Finch's voice. Patient 88, you're not responding. What is it you keep doing with your hands? Tap, tap, tap asterisk. The sound was unmistakably there. It wasn't a clock. The rhythm was too irregular, yet consistent. It wasn't a pipe. It was deliberate. And it seemed to be coming from the patient's side of the conversation. I felt a chill, unrelated to the sub-basement's constant cold. This was different. This was a sound from within the recording itself, something the doctor didn't seem to acknowledge. I continued playing. Dr. Finch, are you tapping on the table, patient 88? Is that how you choose to communicate now? The tapping stopped abruptly. Then a faint, ragged whisper, barely above the static. He watches. My breath hitched. He watches? I mumbled, my voice echoing in the silent room. Who was he? And why was the tapping so distinct, yet ignored by the doctor until he finally called it out? I spent the rest of that night replaying that section of the cylinder, trying to discern more. The tapping seemed to resume sporadically, sometimes fast, sometimes slow, almost like a code. I felt a prickle of unease. This wasn't just a historical artifact. It felt like a trapped moment, a secret waiting to be unearthed. The next night I was back, drawn by an irresistible morbid curiosity. I went straight for box 73, pulling out the remaining cylinders from patient 88. There were 5 in total. Session 1 was silent, except for Finch's increasingly frustrated voice. Session 2 had the tapping, but it was sporadic. Session 3 was the one I'd found. Session 4 was worse. The tapping was louder, more insistent, almost frantic. And patient 88's whispers were more frequent, though still garbled. I could make out fragments. Behind the wall, he waits. Don't let him in. Dr. Finch's voice was sharp, laced with an edge of fear. Patient 88, control yourself. There is no one behind the wall. But the tapping continued, a relentless drumbeat against the doctor's increasingly agitated questions. It sounded less like a patient's nervous habit and more like a desperate attempt to communicate, a frantic signal. Then came Session 5. It was the last one. The cylinder began with a terrible guttural scream, not patient 88's, but Dr. Finch's. It was raw, primal, cutting through the static like a knife. Then, a cacophony of crashing sounds, splintering wood, and a deep, resonant thump that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. And through it all, clear as a bell, the rhythmic tap, tap, tap. But it was different now. It sounded heavier, slower, almost triumphant. The recording ended abruptly, leaving only the hiss of the empty groove. I sat there, frozen, my hand still hovering over the phonograph's arm, my heart hammered against my ribs. What had happened? A patient outburst? An escape? But Finch's scream, it wasn't one of anger, it was pure terror. And that final triumphant tapping, it wasn't from patient 88. It felt malevolent. The sub-basement suddenly felt colder, vast, and utterly empty. The silence was no longer comforting. It was oppressive, watchful. I felt an irrational urge to look over my shoulder, to check the dark corners of the room. I didn't. I couldn't. I was too fixated on the phonograph, on the horrifying story that had just unfolded before me, a story that felt chillingly real. I tried to rationalize it. A sudden collapse of the building, a fire, but the Blackwood Asylum was demolished years later. This was a specific incident recorded, and the tapping. I spent the rest of that night poring over the patient files, searching for any mention of patient 88 or Dr. Finch. I found Finch's personnel file. It stated he had resigned abruptly in late 1891, citing personal reasons and ill health. No mention of an incident, no mention of patient 88 after session 5. It was as if she had simply vanished from the records. As the weeks turned into months, my nights in the archive became a slow descent into paranoia. The tapping from the cylinders had somehow seeped into my reality. I'd hear it when I was alone in the archive, a faint, almost imperceptible sound, like a distant drip or a branch tapping against a window. But there were no windows in the sub-basement. Sometimes it would be louder, clearer, coming from just outside the phonograph room, echoing down the long, narrow aisles of shelves. Just tap, tap, and tap. I'd freeze, holding my breath, listening, my pulse quickening. Each time it would stop as soon as I focused on it. A trick of the mind, I told myself. Sleep deprivation, the power of suggestion. But then things started to escalate. One night, I was cataloging a box of old medical journals. I heard a distinct thump from the far end of the archive, followed by a soft, dragging sound. My blood ran cold. I wasn't alone. I grabbed the heavy ledger I was holding, my makeshift weapon, and slowly crept towards the sound. The air grew perceptibly colder as I approached. I saw nothing. The shelves were undisturbed, but the dragging sound had stopped just before I reached the end of the aisle. I started leaving the lights on in the main archive area, even when I was in the small phonograph room. The isolation was becoming unbearable. I felt watched, not just by the ghosts of the asylum, but by something more present, something that felt like it was here. One evening, I was taking a short break, sitting at my desk, scrolling through my phone. The phonograph room door was ajar, a sliver of light escaping. From within the room, I heard it, a soft, rhythmic tap, tap, tap. It was louder than before, undeniably real, and coming from inside the room. My heart leapt into my throat. I slowly pushed back my chair, my eyes glued to the sliver of light. The tapping continued, steady, relentless. It sounded like something was tapping directly on the phonograph itself. I stood up, my legs trembling. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to run, to leave the building and never look back. But my morbid curiosity, or perhaps a strange sense of duty, compelled me forward. I had to see. I had to know. I crept towards the door, my hand shaking as I reached for the handle. I pushed it open slowly, my eyes scanning the small room. The phonograph sat on its table, undisturbed. The wax cylinder, patient 88, session 5, was still on the spindle where I'd left it, but the needle was down. It was playing, and the sound of the rhythmic tapping was emanating from the horn, just as it had on the recording. Except the phonograph wasn't plugged in. It was an antique, yes, but it still required power for its internal mechanisms, for the spindle to spin. It was completely disconnected from the wall outlet. My breath hitched. The tapping continued, louder now, filling the small room. Tap, 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 asterisk. And then, as I stared, mesmerized by the impossible, the cylinder began to spin. Slowly at first, then gaining speed, a low, guttural groan rising from the horn, followed by the terrible raw scream of Dr. Finch, the crashing sounds, the splintering wood, the heavy thump, and through it all, the triumphant, malevolent tap, tap, tap. I stumbled backward, hitting the doorframe, my mind reeling. This wasn't a recording playing. This was a replay of an event happening now through a cursed object. The air in the room dropped to an icy cold, so sharp it burned my lungs. A shadow, deeper than any natural darkness, would detach itself from the corner of the room. It was tall, impossibly thin, and seemed to ripple like heat haze. It had no discernible features, just a vague humanoid outline, but I felt its focus on me. A profound, ancient malevolence radiated from it, a cold, hungry presence. The tapping from the phonograph intensified, becoming a furious, deafening drumbeat. The shadow began to move, gliding towards me, its form flickering at the edges. I could feel the pressure of its presence, an invisible weight pressing down on my chest, stealing my breath. And then, from the phonograph's horn, a new sound emerged, cutting through the chaos. A voice. Not patient 88's whisper, not Dr. Finch's scream, but a deep, resonant voice that vibrated through my very bones. You hear me. It was the voice of the tapping. It was the voice of the shadow. It was the voice of the thing that had been trapped with patient 88, the thing that had killed Dr. Finch. And it was here, with me. Panic, raw and absolute, finally seized me. I screamed, a strangled sound that barely escaped my throat. I turned and fled, not caring about the job, the archives, or anything else. I burst out of the sub-basement, scrambling up the stairs, my feet pounding on the old wood, the sound of the triumphant tapping echoing in my ears, chasing me. I didn't stop until I was outside, gasping for air in the cool night. I looked back at the imposing stone building, its windows dark and uninviting. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that I could never go back. Not to that job, not to that building, not to those archives. I called the Historical Society the next morning, inventing a sudden family emergency. They were understanding, but I could hear the surprise in their voice. I was a good worker. I told them I wouldn't be returning. It's been months since that night. I still hear the tapping sometimes, when I'm alone in my apartment, in the quietest hours of the night. Tap, tap, tap. It's faint, easily dismissed as a creaking pipe or a branch against the window, but I know what it is. I know what it means. The archives of the Blackwood Asylum were not just records of the dead. They were a conduit. And I, in my naive curiosity, had opened it. I had heard the call, and the thing that answered, it knew my name now. It knew I could hear it. I still wonder what patient 88 was trying to warn Finch about. He watches, behind the wall. Don't let him in. She wasn't insane. She was terrified. And she was right. The thing was there. It always had been. And now I carry a piece of it with me, a chilling, rhythmic reminder that some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed. And some things, once heard, can never be unheard. The tapping is a promise. And I know, deep in my bones, that one day it won't be just a sound anymore. It will be a presence, and it will be here.
Thank you so much for sticking with me to the end. I really hope you enjoyed it. If you liked this video, please hit that like button and don't forget to subscribe for more content like this. Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.